All right. So welcome, Christian. I'm really looking forward to your talk. And yeah, tell us all about what's happening in the world of security in Web3.
Great. Well, thank you, Dan, and thanks for having me. So I'll talk about comprehensive security strategies in Web3. And this is a presentation, but obviously the room here is fairly small, and so don't be shy in interrupting me and asking questions. I want to make that a little bit more interactive, more fun. Just a briefly introduction about myself. So I'm a researcher in residence at the Forta Foundation. In my role as researcher in residence, I primarily analyze on-chain attacks and then work with the broader Forta community to strengthen attack detection. Prior to Forta, I worked at Microsoft for 14 years on the Defender product line. In a security researcher and data science role. And what's interesting here is like going from Web 2 to Web 3, there's a lot of things that Web 2 has already figured out that Web 3 is kind of still figuring out in this general security space. So you may have heard about hacks in Web 3 with hundreds of millions of dollars being lost. Chain Analysis put out a report earlier this year that estimated the losses on protocol attacks to be $2 billion. This year, we're already at $3 billion plus, and that is despite the bear market. And so whatever we're doing in this space doesn't seem to be working quite well. Now, one way we're thinking about on-chain attacks is in these attack stages, which is very analogous to the Web 2 kill chain. It's essentially a set of steps that an attacker has to go through in order to accomplish their objective. And so if you're thinking about an on-chain attack, well, first of all, the attacker needs to be funded. They need to have, let's say on Ethereum, they need to have some Ether in order to pay for transaction costs. Then they need to prepare the attack. And a common misconception is that attacks on-chain are atomic. That is rarely the case. And often attackers deploy, let's say, an attacker smart contract in preparation for exploitation. We observe that in about 50% of the cases. Then they exploit a protocol, draining it of digital assets. And then once the digital assets are obtained, they move into the money laundering stage where first of all, they exchange tokens into native assets and then using privacy protocols like Tornado Cash to launder the funds. And so there is a lot of opportunities here within an attack that allows you to detect and mitigate an attack. And here I have a few examples listed from this year. So inverse finance, this was a protocol that actually got exploited twice this year. Last time it was $1.2 million. So this was a flash loan assisted price manipulation attack. The attack end to end happened in about 8 minutes. So there's not a ton of time to respond to an attack. In particular, if you think about kind of manual incident response processes. But if you're thinking about automated incident response processes, 8 minutes is a long time. Curve Finance, this was an attack on the Curve dApp, which essentially manipulated the dApp to insert malicious transactions that would give the attacker access to users' wallets. And basically, so you go to the Curve Finance dApp, you think you're interacting with the proper dApp, and then you get essentially a MetaMask pop-up that says, hey, do you want to approve this address to access your tokens? And this address in this particular case was the attacker. And so that allowed then the attacker to essentially reach into users' wallets and drain them. And the last attack is the Ronin bridge attack. This was the largest attack in the space so far. It was $624 million lost. This was an attack that was actually on kind of Web2 components, so the validators were compromised. Interesting aspect about this attack is that it took over 6 days to notice. So think of, more than $500 million were drained out of the bridge and nobody noticed for 6 days. The US government tied this particular attack to the Lazarus Group, which has ties to North Korea. And so that kind of gives you an idea on the type of adversaries that are operating in the Web3 space. A lot of motivation, a lot of resources. And so if there is a vulnerability, they will find it eventually. So let's look at the inverse finance attack in more detail. And so I will essentially show you here screenshots around each of the transactions that the attacker issued on chain by looking at the block explorer. So the 7B address, that is the attacker. And so the first thing that you see is that the attacker obtains initial funds, a small amount, 1 ETH, through the privacy protocol Tornado Cash. So that's kind of the first signal that we receive. Now, you may say, well, the just funding through Tornado Cash, that is happening all the time. It doesn't necessarily, isn't necessarily indicative of, hey, that you're dealing with an attacker, but it is a signal that is suspicious that can later be used to identify the attacker. Then the next step, the attacker deploys a smart contract. And as I mentioned, we see of all the attacks that we've analyzed, about 50% of all protocol attacks involve an attacker smart contract. When you look at this transaction, one thing that you'll notice is that on Etherscan, the smart contract is not verified. So there's no source code available. If you look through most of the smart contracts that are deployed on Etherscan, at least reputable protocols usually upload their source code so it can be verified on Etherscan. In this particular case, of course, the attacker didn't go through that step. Again, kind of a suspicious signal. Then what we see here is the exploit transaction. And there is a bunch of information that we're able to obtain here. So first of all, the attacker used flashbots. So if you're not familiar with flashbots, this is a network that essentially integrates with miners and now, of course, validators directly, such that transactions bypass the mempool. So it's primarily used for preserving privacy and prevent front running. A lot of MAV bots use flash bots, but attackers do so as well. So you wouldn't see this particular transaction sitting in the mempool, but rather it just kind of shows up as a mined transaction. The other thing that you observe here is that a flash loan is used. Again, if you're not familiar with flash loans are loans that you're able to take, but you need to pay back the loan within the same transaction with interest. And again, this is a mechanism that is usually used for arbitrage, but can also be used by attackers to manipulate prices that then open up the door for certain types of attacks. So in this particular case, the attacker borrowed 27,000 wrapped Bitcoin from the Aave protocol. And then if we look at the state, as a result of this particular transaction, you're able to see, and here I'm now using a different block explorer, the BlockSec block explorer. It kind of makes state changes, token transfers a little bit more explainable. But what you see here is that the attacker address, the F508 address, received a whole bunch of Curve tokens, 90,000 USDT and 53 wrapped Bitcoin. So this is after the transaction completed. And so now you're able to see, hey, there's a whole bunch of funds that are moving into the attacker's wallet. And then down below, you see where the funds are coming from. And then once the attacker has obtained these funds, so keep in mind they're having wrapped Bitcoin and USDT. These are ERC20 tokens on chain. And ERC20 tokens are just smart contracts. Some of these smart contracts have block listing capability. I think USDT and USDC certainly do. And so the attacker needs to swap their ERC20 tokens into native tokens very quickly, because otherwise they run risk of being added to the block list and getting their assets frozen. So as you see in this particular transaction, they quickly convert their ERC20 into Ether. And then as a last step, they proceed in laundering the funds through the privacy protocol Tornado Cash. So that is kind of the attack end to end. As I mentioned, it's about 8 minutes from kind of Tornado Cash funding to Tornado Cash money laundering. Let me pause here for any questions.
So which exchange did they use to convert WBTC to ETH? I didn't see.
The Uniswap V3.
Oh, they did. I see.
Any other questions?
Not question, but like a comment. I mean, most of these attacks are like not on the blockchain protocol itself. These are all on the dApps mostly.
They're on the applications that are built
Right.
on top of the chain. Yeah, you're right. It's not that Ethereum is getting attacked. It is applications that are built on top of Ethereum.
Right, yeah.
Could you show like how did the attacker steal money after the flash loan?
So in this particular attack, they manipulated the price. So they had a lot of wrapped BTC that they then of course able to swap to whatever token they want, and then they're able to manipulate an oracle essentially that Inverse Finance relied on, and then they were able to take out a under collateralized loan. So it's an economic attack.
I see. Okay.
Can you say a little bit about the consequence of the attack? Who actually lost money here, and how were they made whole?
So the Inverse Finance protocol lost money. Now, all that money that is locked into the Inverse Finance protocol is, of course, users' assets. So end users lost money. And I don't think in this particular instance, the funds were recovered. Now, one thing that I'm observing many of these protocols now do, so there's, so a protocol can have a bug bounty, right? That essentially tries to attract ethical hackers to find bugs and report them responsibly. But a lot of the protocols are proceeding into a reactive bug bounty, where a hack occurs, millions of dollars are being lost, and then the protocol tries to communicate with the attacker, basically saying, if you return, let's say, 90% of the funds, you can keep 10%, we will not try to pursue you criminally. And that certainly has worked in certain instances. But is certainly not a guarantee. And I think on the Inverse Finance attack, that approach did not work.
I guess what I was asking is, did the end users end up losing funds, or did the investors of Inverse end up losing funds?
I think, I mean, the end users of Inverse Finance, right? Like, these are end users / investors, right? Because they're using the protocol, they lock in assets to obtain a yield, and those locked up assets were lost.
Yeah, I meant the investors of Inverse, the investors who invested in Inverse, the company.
No, I don't think they lost anything, and I don't know whether Inverse actually had kind of VC funding to stand up their protocol.
Yeah.
But your point, like I think in the there was a particular bridge exploit. Hundreds of millions of dollars were lost, and then the investors, the VCs, actually stepped in and you know, we like basically funded the protocol with the same amount of the stolen assets, so the protocol would essentially survive.
Yeah, I think that was on Solana, right?
Yeah, I think it was a wormhole bridge.
A wormhole, yeah, yeah. That's
So this was a kind of outlining an attack, and I think what the industry has been relying on so far is primarily smart contract audits during the pre-deployment stage. And I believe smart contract audits are an essential step in securing a protocol, but it is not sufficient by itself. So on the pre-deployment stage, protocols need to utilize templates that are already audited, don't reinvent the wheel, smart contract audits, but then also, most importantly, also security strategies in the post-deployment stage. So once your protocol is live on chain, think about bug bounties. And I'm talking about the proactive bug bounties where you go to Immunify and there is a bounty posted to really attract the ethical hackers. And then also think about real-time monitoring and alerting and incident response. And one thing that I'm not mentioning on the slide here is cyber security insurance. I think this is something that is quite unique in the Web3 space, given that the losses are quantifiable. And so I think that really opens up the door for great cyber security insurance products. And there's already some protocols like Sherlock that start offering these services as well. And so real-time monitoring and alerting, that is really where the FORDA network sits and the FORDA protocol sits. So let me explain to you what FORDA is real briefly. So FORDA is a decentralized network that monitors on-chain transactions in real time for threats. So think of it as decentralized security, camera, and alarm system for Web3. And the FORDA network is comprised of detection bots and scan nodes. So scan node is a FORDA node that is responsible to forward transactions and blocks to detection bots. And these detection bots are developed by the community. So it's a permissionless protocol. Anybody can develop and deploy a detection bot on the FORDA network. And so the scan node forwards transactions to detection bots that are deployed on these scan nodes. Detection bots are usually deployed on multiple scan nodes at the same time in order to create some redundancy and increase the reliability of the monitoring solution. And then these detection bots, it's essentially a script, piece of logic, could be a simple heuristic or a machine learning model that then analyzes the transaction and emit an alert if something suspicious or malicious has been identified. And what really, like what excites me personally about FORDA and the general approach is that it is community driven. And what that does, it brings like diversity to the network. So, you may have, let's say, a flash loan attack, and a security researcher may say, hey, I'm going to detect this flash loan attack this way. And then a data scientist comes along and says, no, we'll develop a bot that takes, a machine learning approach. And then an economist comes along that may approach this problem very differently. And the Forda network is open, permissionless, and anybody can contribute to the network. Now you may ask, well, why would you want to contribute to the network? The way the network is set up is through crypto economic incentives to drive certain behaviors. So the scan nodes, for instance, if you run a scan node today, and again, anybody can run a scan node, you are getting regular rewards if you meet certain SLA requirements. Detection bots, similarly, there is going to be an incentive program where if you're developing a detection bot or a set of detection bots that identify attacks down the road, you should get rewards for that activity as well. And then lastly, of course, you have to think about the subscriber, like who's paying for this, and that down the road will be subscribers to alerts of the Forda network. The Forda network, there's an explorer. So think of it as a blockchain explorer on top of the Forda network that allows you to essentially explore all the alerts that were raised by any of the bots. So here we have like a potential exploiter alert. So you get information about the transaction. You're able to, of course, hop into Etherscan. Then there's some description as well as associated metadata. And down here, you essentially see that the bot runs on multiple scan nodes. So that's kind of the redundancy that I've talked about. And then there is the network page that essentially gives you insights into all the networks that are currently supported. So there's 7 EVM compatible chains. And then on the right here, you see essentially the size of the network. So currently we have maybe 2,500 scan nodes and several hundred detection bots. So as I mentioned, the way we're thinking about these attacks is in these 4 attack stages: funding, preparation, exploitation, and money laundering. And there is a wide range of detection bots that are deployed today that essentially identify attacker behavior within each of these stages. Let me explain a little bit on kind of some of the approaches that you can take with a detection bot. So here we have a detection bot that is a flash loan bot that sits essentially in the exploitation stage. So as I mentioned, flash loans are temporary loans, excuse me, that have to be paid back in one transaction. And that allows borrowers to obtain large amounts of tokens. And this is used for arbitrage. But as I mentioned earlier, it can also be used to manipulate prices temporarily. And that can then be used to exploit a protocol that relies on a vulnerable oracle. And so the way a detection bot can detect this particular behavior is essentially monitoring all transactions for a flash loan and then analyzing essentially the profits that the transaction generated and threshold that. So it's a very simple heuristic. Another example in the exploitation phase is Rugpoles. So Rugpoles are essentially tokens that are hyped by the creators. And then, once they're traded on DEXs and people start buying them, eventually the creators will either dump their existing tokens or mint new tokens, and the price crashes. And then, of course, all the holders are left holding the bag. And so the way that can be detected is through simple time series anomaly detection. So the detection bots do have the ability to maintain state over time. And so what the detection bot essentially does, it monitors the price and then builds a simple time series anomaly model that takes into account seasonality and volatility, and then essentially alerts on when the price breaks out the expected range. And then lastly, this is, I think, a really neat approach. It's essentially exploit simulation. So as I mentioned, attackers do have to deploy, or many attackers deploy an attacker smart contract. So that's kind of the first step. And then they invoke that smart contract to exploit the protocol. Now, when they deploy the contract, all the code is already there, right? It's visible to everybody. The transaction has been mined. And so what one of the detection bots on the Forda network does, it forks the chain at that point in time, and then starts invoking all the functions on the attacker smart contract. And while it does that, it then essentially monitors, are there large asset movements happening? And so what that allows the bot to do is to essentially emit a high confidence alert that an attack is about to happen before the exploit transaction has been mined. Now, the way the attack contract is getting invoked today, it's really just looking at functions that are exposed and then kind of guessing some input parameters. I think what would be a very interesting research area is around how to fuzz these contracts and essentially get to the exploit behavior that is somewhere embedded, of course, in the code.
But wouldn't an easy defense from the attacker would be to just require a key in order to call a function and to call the functions? So unless you provide the right key, the function just doesn't do anything.
That is correct.
So then you're going to have to do some sort of static analysis in the contract, not just call the functions.
That's right. I think like attacker smart contract detection, you do need to kind of have a combination approach. You could static analysis. Now, static analysis, you have the issue of obfuscation, and then dynamic analysis, you have the issue of, well, how do you invoke the smart contract so it runs? But I think the problem is very analogous to what you see in malware, right? Like traditional malware also tries to obfuscate. It also tries to prevent from being run. And so I think a lot of the techniques in the Web2 space that deal with malware are probably transferable to the Web3 malicious smart contract analysis.
And how does this scale? I mean, do you do every time somebody deploys a contract, you're going to go and run all this analysis on the contract?
That's correct.
But aren't there like isn't this a scaling problem? There are a lot of contracts deployed all the time.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's way more transactions that are coming through, and I think that's again kind of the strength of the Forda network, where you're able to have thousands of scan nodes at the same time that deploy your bot, and so it's really distributed.
And how long does it take you to clone, like on a typical example?
So the forking,
like seconds or like minutes? Or?
So the forking of the chain and then kind of simulating an attack contract that way takes about 2 minutes.
Okay.
So not very fast. And so now the question is, how fast is the attacker and how fast is the detector, right? And so there's certainly an opportunity to speed things up. And I know of certain companies that are using proprietary forking solutions as opposed to kind of the standard that is available like in Nash.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Now, one thing, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, is that the individual bots that I described, like the Tornado Cash funding, that is merely a signal, right? It is not sufficient to raise an alert. And so how do we, because it really has a high false positive rate if you were to do that. And so one way we're thinking about this is kind of a layered detection system, where we have foundational bots like the Tornado Cash funding, a smart contract deployed, Flashbot, etc. And then those alerts are actually consumed by a secondary system we refer to as hierarchical bots that then essentially combine them together such that the combination of alerts are consistent with attacker behavior. So if we observe, let's say, an alert in the funding, preparation, exploitation, money laundering stage, all emitted essentially by the same EOA, externally owned account, then we can say, well, that is too much of a coincidence, and we raise an alert. And that approach works very well. Now, one thing that attackers have started to do is to essentially split up their attack across multiple accounts. So they may get funded from Tornado Cash with account A, and then they deploy a smart contract with account B, which would really break this approach of combining alerts together under a common EOA. And so we do some simple clustering on top of transaction data to group together essentially EOAs and contract addresses on to the same entity that we believe controls those addresses, and that is at least currently effective in kind of overcoming their technique of splitting things up. Any questions? So, you know, when a protocol wants to get monitoring in place, they can rely, of course, on some of the bots that are already deployed that kind of identify generic attacker behavior. But there may be additional risks that are within the protocol that are not covered by that. And so we recommend that protocols go through threat modeling to systematically uncover those risks. And you know, I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of techniques in the Web2 space that haven't really made it to Web3, and threat modeling is such a technique. Everybody in traditional security knows about threat modeling. In Web3, it is not commonly known or adopted. And so what threat modeling really does, it first of all, you decompose the protocol, then you identify the risk, and there's a variety of frameworks that you can use to kind of prompt yourself to kind of inspect your protocol under a particular aspect. And then you're able to score each of those risks, rank them, and then devise mitigation techniques. Now, in context of Forta and what I'm focusing on, monitoring, of course, monitoring is an option, but ideally, when a risk gets identified, what you would want to see is design changes, code changes that actually mitigate the risk. But if that is not possible, then at least keeping an eye out on the risk through monitoring is the next best step. And here is just kind of a threat model of a hypothetical protocol. So you have a lending protocol called Spook. That's a collateralized lending protocol. So you can deposit and withdraw assets. or you can repay and withdraw collateral. And so as you kind of decompose the protocol, you may want to ask yourself some questions around what should not happen. Where are the trust boundaries? What are known risk patterns? So for instance, this particular protocol relies on a external library to calculate interest. It relies on external Oracle. And these are all, of course, then areas where risk areas within the overall protocol. So if the Oracle price, for instance, is stale, then the collateral doesn't get calculated correctly, and potentially somebody could take out an under collateralized loan. And so in this particular instance, well, one way you could mitigate that is by maybe introducing a backup Oracle, or putting monitoring in place to alert you if the Oracle price doesn't get updated. So that would be kind of an example. For the network allows anybody to develop bots. I kind of explained a little bit around the capabilities that exist within the overall framework. Bots, again, are just simple scripts, JavaScript, TypeScript, or Python. And they're extremely powerful in that you're able to like fork the chain, you're able to maintain state, you're able to run machine learning models. And so that gives a lot of flexibility to implement detection logic. And then, as I mentioned, they're permissionless. It's a permissionless network. And so you're able to submit that bot once you have developed it to the Fortinet network and immediately get alerts that you can subscribe to. And then lastly, and that is also quite underdeveloped in the Web3 space, is the incident response mechanism. I talked about the inverse finance attack was 8 minutes end to end. And usually that's kind of the magnitude of time it takes for these attacks in the order of minutes. And so if you think about manual incident response processes, they're not going to be very effective. What you really need is automated incident response processes. And talking to protocols in that space, they are very hesitant to put automated incident response processes in place because they're concerned essentially with denial of service attacks, where somebody is able to generate an alert that is essentially a false positive that then would cause that protocol to be paused. Because pausing seems to be kind of the standard incident response action that we see in Web3. And I think that is, again, kind of an area where there's probably a lot of research opportunities around what are effective incident response mechanisms that will slow down the attacker or mitigate the attack, while at the same time leaving the protocol functioning. And one idea that's been floating around is time locks that are maybe potentially value dependent. So if you, let's say, the Binance bridge attack 3 weeks ago, the attacker was able to mint 1 million BNB tokens, which was, I think, 270 million in one transaction. Well, should that really be allowed? Like, should you instantly able to mint that many tokens? Maybe if you mint that many tokens, you have to wait a few hours or days. Whereas if you mint, just 50 or so, you don't want to create that sort of friction. And so that is something that we're thinking about, and would love to hear your ideas in terms of how that could potentially be approached. But
wouldn't an attacker just break their attack into multiple small transactions?
Yes, that could be a way to circumvent that. But now you have to, first of all, split it up. So there's many transactions that each have to get mined. there's a transaction cost, and then there's also a gas limit in the block that then could potentially force the attacker to execute their attack over many, many blocks, as opposed to today, you just do it in one transaction.
Yeah. Wouldn't and just as you're talking, I was thinking like wouldn't like another form of mitigation would be to say that if a contract seems to be able to do something that seems undesirable, rather than pausing the protocol, you could just block that address.
Yeah, that is true. Again, you would have to be highly confident that the alert is accurate, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is still a challenge in the space. You know, precision on some of the detectors in the Forta network that even kind of combine alerts is at 20%. And so there's going to be many false positives. And so so I think it's two approaches, right? First of all, kind of create more options in terms of the incident response, and then on the other side, of course, the precision around the alerts that are generated by the network need to increase. Yeah, and so that was all that I had. So generally, I feel like Web3 needs more focus in the security area. I think we've come a long way over the last couple of years, but the attacks are certainly not slowing down, and so folks really need to think about security comprehensively and experiment and see what works, what doesn't. It's going to take us a few more years, I'm sure, before we get into a better state.